Before Queen Victoria became the symbol of an age, she was a child whose future had already been decided for her. On May 24, 1819, Princess Alexandrina Victoria was born at Kensington Palace in London. She was the only child of Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son of King George III, and Princess Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld. At birth, she was fifth in line to the British throne. No one could know what her future would hold, but her childhood would shape the woman she became. Victoria's father died when she was only 8 months old. His death left her mother, the Duchess of Kent, raising a daughter while the succession gradually moved in Victoria's direction. By the time Victoria was a child, becoming queen was no longer a distant possibility. She was becoming the likely future monarch. Her upbringing was unusually controlled. Victoria was educated at home, kept under close supervision, and, according to historical accounts, was rarely allowed to be alone. Her mother and courtier Sir John Conroy played major roles in managing her early life. This system of restrictions became known as the Kensington system. Historians have debated its motives and the degree of influence each person exercised, but Victoria experienced a sheltered childhood. She kept a diary from a young age, recording lessons, daily activities, and events around her. She also developed a strong interest in drawing and painting. Her journals would later become an important source for understanding her own account of her life. For years, Victoria lived under rules that limited her freedom. Yet the child being prepared for the throne was not simply passive. As she grew older, she increasingly resisted attempts to control her future. Then, in June 1837, everything changed. Her uncle, King William IV, died, and Victoria, just 18 years old, became queen. The sheltered girl from Kensington Palace was suddenly the monarch of Britain. But becoming queen did not mean the struggle for independence was over. In fact, it was only the beginning. And her first decisions as a young monarch would reveal how determined she was to control her own life. When Victoria became queen on June 20, 1837, she was only 18 years old. She had spent her childhood under intense supervision. Now, suddenly, the people who had controlled so much of her life had to face a new reality. Victoria was no longer simply a girl being prepared for a throne. She was the monarch. One of her earliest priorities was establishing her independence. Victoria moved into Buckingham Palace, which became her principal residence in London, and she began separating her official life from the restrictions of her childhood. Sir John Conroy, who had exercised considerable influence within her mother's household, did not receive the position of power he had hoped for. Victoria refused to make him her private secretary or give him the authority he had sought. The change was significant. For years, Victoria had lived under a system in which other people determined much of her daily routine. Now ministers, officials, and members of the royal household had to deal with a young woman who was determined to make her own decisions. But there was another challenge waiting for her. Britain was a constitutional monarchy. Victoria was queen, but she did not govern the country alone. Her ministers were responsible for government, and the young monarch had to learn how to work within a complicated political system. At first, she relied heavily on William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, the Whig Prime Minister. Melbourne became an important mentor during Victoria's first years on the throne. He explained political procedures and helped the inexperienced queen understand the world of government. Victoria trusted him, and their relationship became one of the most important influences on her early reign. But Victoria still had much to learn. She was entering a political world divided by fierce arguments over reform, religion, the economy, and the role of Parliament. Every decision could attract criticism, and every mistake could become public. Then came a political crisis that tested her independence. In 1839, Melbourne's government resigned after losing support in the House of Commons. Victoria was required to appoint a new Prime Minister. The man she turned to was Sir Robert Peel, a leading Conservative politician. But the transition did not go smoothly. Peel wanted changes to Victoria's household appointments. Victoria resisted those changes, and the disagreement became known as the bedchamber crisis. The young queen refused to simply accept what politicians demanded of her. For Victoria, this was about more than household positions. It was another test of whether she would control her own court. And while that political battle was unfolding, another man had entered her life, one who would soon change it completely. His name was Prince Albert. And before long, the young queen would face a decision that could transform both her private life and her reign. For the first 2 years of her reign, Victoria was learning how to survive the pressures of being queen. But in 1839, her life was about to change in a way that politics could not explain. Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha was Victoria's first cousin. The two had met when they were younger, but when Albert visited Britain again in October 1839, their relationship took on a different meaning. Albert was 20 years old. Victoria was 20. As queen, Victoria could not simply wait for a man to propose marriage to her. The constitutional and social position of a reigning queen made the situation unusual. If Victoria wanted to marry Albert, the decision had to come from her. On October 15, 1839, Victoria proposed to Albert. He accepted. Their engagement was announced shortly afterward, and on February 10, 1840, they were married at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. Victoria wore a white satin wedding dress decorated with Huntington lace. The dress became famous, and although white wedding clothing existed before Victoria, her highly publicized choice helped establish white as the fashionable color for Western brides. But the marriage was about more than ceremony. Victoria and Albert developed a close personal relationship, and Albert became an important figure in both her private and public life. He increasingly took on responsibilities within the royal household and became involved in cultural, educational, and scientific projects. Their family grew rapidly. Victoria eventually gave birth to 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters. Through their marriages, the family's connections spread across European royal houses. Yet Albert's influence was not limited to the family. He became strongly associated with Britain's growing interest in science, industry, education, and international exhibition. His most famous public project came in 1851. The Great Exhibition opened in London's Hyde Park inside the enormous Crystal Palace. Exhibits from Britain and many other countries displayed machinery, industrial products, inventions, and works of art. Millions of visitors attended. For Albert and his supporters, the exhibition represented confidence in industry, technology, and international exchange. And while Britain celebrated its growing wealth and technological power, something much larger was happening beyond London's grand exhibitions. The British Empire was expanding across continents. Victoria's name was becoming increasingly connected with a period of enormous industrial and social transformation. But behind the ceremonies, the growing family, and the image of national confidence, Victoria's personal world was about to face its greatest test. Because the man who had become her husband, advisor, and closest companion would not live to see the end of her reign. And when tragedy finally came, it would change Queen Victoria for the rest of her life. By the middle of the 19th century, Victoria was no longer the inexperienced teenager who had first taken the throne. She had become an established monarch, and her life was increasingly connected to the enormous changes taking place across Britain. The country was being transformed by industrialization. Railways were expanding, cities were growing, factories were changing the economy, and new technologies were altering how people communicated and traveled. Victoria and Albert became closely associated with this changing Britain. Their family also continued to grow. By the time Victoria's children were adults, the royal family had become deeply connected to other European dynasties through marriage. But while Victoria's personal world seemed secure, Britain itself was facing enormous challenges. The British Empire was expanding, and British power extended across territories in Asia, Africa, the Pacific, and elsewhere. Victoria became a symbol associated with the empire, although Britain's imperial system was controlled through governments, parliament, officials, and institutions rather than by the Queen personally. In India, Britain's influence would become especially important. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 led to a major transformation. The East India Company's rule came to an end, and in 1858 the British Crown assumed direct responsibility for governing India. Years later, in 1876, Parliament passed the Royal Titles Act, allowing Victoria to adopt the title Empress of India. But while the political world around her was changing, Victoria's private life remained centered on Albert. They had 9 children together. Their marriage was not always without disagreements, and historians have documented tensions between them. Yet Albert became one of the most important people in Victoria's life and an influential advisor. Then, in 1861, disaster struck. Albert became seriously ill. On December 14, 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle. He was only 42 years old. The official cause of his death was recorded as typhoid fever, although later historians have debated the exact illness responsible. For Victoria, the loss was devastating. She withdrew from many public appearances and remained in mourning for years. She continued to preserve Albert's memory through photographs, rooms, clothing, and personal rituals. Her grief became so visible that it began affecting the public image of the monarchy. Britain had lost its prince consort. Victoria had lost her husband. And the Queen who had once fought so hard to establish her independence now had to learn how to live and rule without the man who had stood beside her for more than 2 decades. But Albert's death created another question. Could Victoria continue to rule effectively while remaining largely withdrawn from public life? For years, the answer was uncertain. And the longer she stayed away, the more pressure grew for the Queen to return. Her greatest personal loss was now becoming a political problem, and the next chapter of Victoria's reign would determine whether she could overcome it. After Prince Albert's death, Victoria's life changed dramatically. The woman who had once appeared beside her husband at public ceremonies became increasingly withdrawn. She spent long periods away from London and reduced her participation in public events. Her grief was deeply personal, but it also created a problem for the monarchy. The British public expected its queen to be visible. As years passed, criticism of Victoria increased. Newspapers and political commentators questioned her absence, while some people began asking whether the monarchy was still necessary. Victoria, however, did not abandon her responsibilities. Gradually, she began returning to public life. She continued working through government papers, meeting ministers, and dealing with official matters. Although she no longer had Albert beside her, she remained actively involved in the constitutional duties of the monarchy. Her reign was also entering a new phase. In 1876, Victoria became Empress of India. The title reflected Britain's expanding imperial position, although India remained governed through the British government rather than by Victoria personally. The title also became part of the public image surrounding her later reign. During these years, Victoria's family became increasingly important to European politics. Her children married into several royal and princely families. Her daughter Victoria, known as the Princess Royal, married Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia. Other children married into royal families in countries including Russia, Germany, Greece, and Spain. This eventually gave Victoria an extraordinary network of descendants. She became known as the grandmother of Europe. But this nickname can sometimes make her family story sound simpler than it really was. Her descendants did occupy European thrones, but their relationships were also connected to the complicated political rivalries of the period. Victoria herself lived through an era in which European powers were becoming increasingly competitive. And there was another personal relationship that attracted attention late in her life. In 1887, an Indian attendant named Abdul Karim arrived in Britain to serve the Queen during her Golden Jubilee year. Victoria became unusually close to him. She learned some Hindustani from Karim and described him as an important companion and teacher. The relationship was controversial within the royal household, where some members of the court strongly objected to his growing influence. Yet Victoria defended the friendship. By this stage, she was no longer the isolated young woman who had inherited the throne at 18. She had survived political battles, marriage, motherhood, enormous personal loss, and decades of public criticism. But her story was approaching its final chapter. Victoria had ruled Britain for more than 60 years. The young queen had become an elderly monarch, and the world around her was changing faster than ever. Soon, the longest reign of her era would come to an end. And the final years of Victoria's life would reveal just how much the world had changed since the lonely girl at Kensington Palace first became queen. By the final decade of the 19th century, Queen Victoria had become almost inseparable from the image of Britain itself. She had been on the throne for more than 60 years. Entire generations had grown up knowing no other monarch. But the Britain of her youth had almost disappeared. When Victoria became queen in 1837, communication depended heavily on letters and messengers, and railways were still developing. By the end of her reign, Britain had an enormous railway network, telegraph communication, expanding industry, and technologies that would have seemed almost unimaginable to the young princess at Kensington Palace. Victoria herself had changed with the country. She was no longer the young queen learning the rules of government from Lord Melbourne. She was an experienced monarch who had worked with numerous prime ministers and witnessed decades of political change. Her family had also become enormous. Victoria had 9 children and eventually dozens of grandchildren. Her descendants were connected to several European royal families, including those of Germany, Russia, Romania, Greece, Norway, and Spain. This network earned her the famous nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. But beneath the impressive family connections was a complicated reality. Europe's royal families were increasingly tied to governments and national rivalries that would eventually create dangerous tensions. Victoria could not control the political decisions of her descendants or the countries they represented. Her own health was also declining. In January 1901, Victoria traveled to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight with members of her family. She had been experiencing declining health, and her condition became increasingly serious. On January 22, 1901, Queen Victoria died at Osborne House. She was 81 years old. Her reign had lasted 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days. At the time of her death, it was the longest reign of any British monarch. Her son Edward succeeded her as king, bringing the Victorian era to an end. Victoria's funeral took place in February 1901. Her coffin was transported from Osborne to the mainland and then to London before her burial at the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore, beside Prince Albert. Millions mourned the woman who had occupied the British throne for most of their lives. But Victoria's legacy was far more complicated than a simple story of a beloved queen. Her reign was associated with industrial growth, technological progress, constitutional development, and a powerful British Empire. At the same time, the Victorian period was also marked by poverty, class inequality, political conflict, and the expansion of imperial rule over millions of people. Victoria herself was a constitutional monarch, not an absolute ruler. Many of the major political decisions of the period were made by elected politicians and governments. Yet her name became attached to an entire age. The Victorian era was over. But Victoria's story was not finished. Because long after her death, historians would continue debating the woman behind the crown, and whether the lonely child who once struggled for control of her own life truly understood the enormous empire she came to represent. And that leaves one final question: what did Queen Victoria's 63 years on the throne actually leave behind? Queen Victoria died in 1901, but the world she helped define did not disappear with her. For more than 63 years, she had remained at the center of British public life. She became queen as an 18-year-old girl and died as an 81-year-old monarch whose reign had lasted longer than most people's entire lives. But what did she actually leave behind? Her reign transformed Britain. The Victorian period witnessed extraordinary industrial and technological development. Railways connected cities and towns. Telegraph networks allowed information to travel across enormous distances. New industries expanded, cities grew, and inventions changed everyday life. But progress came with a darker side. Industrial Britain was also a society marked by severe poverty, dangerous working conditions, child labor, overcrowded cities, and enormous differences between rich and poor. And beyond Britain, the British Empire expanded across the globe. At its height, the empire controlled territories on multiple continents and governed hundreds of millions of people. Victoria became a powerful symbol of that empire, particularly after she became Empress of India in 1876. Yet Victoria was not an absolute ruler. Britain was a constitutional monarchy, and political power rested primarily with Parliament and the government. Prime ministers and elected politicians made many of the major decisions of the period. That distinction matters when looking at Victoria's legacy. She represented the empire, but she did not personally direct every imperial policy. She was also a woman who lived through extraordinary personal experiences. She lost her father as an infant. She spent much of her childhood under strict supervision. She became queen before she was 20. She married Prince Albert and built a large family. Then she lost Albert when he was only 42. She spent decades carrying the responsibilities of the throne while living with the memory of the man who had been her closest companion. Her descendants eventually connected her family to royal houses throughout Europe. And yet, the same family connections that made her the grandmother of Europe would later become part of a much more dangerous European story. Within decades of Victoria's death, Europe would be devastated by the First World War. The royal families connected to Victoria would find themselves on opposing sides of that conflict. Her lifetime had begun in a world of horse-drawn transportation and limited communication. It ended in the age of electricity, modern industry, global telegraph networks, and automobiles. Few monarchs have ever witnessed such a dramatic transformation. But perhaps the most fascinating part of Victoria's story is where it began. She started as a lonely child whose life was controlled by adults around her. She became a young queen determined to make her own decisions. She became a wife, a mother, a widow, and eventually one of the most recognizable monarchs in modern history. Yet questions remain. How much did her childhood shape the way she ruled? How much influence did the people closest to her truly have? And how should we judge a monarch whose name became attached to both extraordinary progress and a vast empire built through British power? There are no simple answers. Queen Victoria was neither simply the lonely girl of her childhood nor merely the powerful symbol of an empire. She was a complicated historical figure who lived through a period of enormous change. Her reign ended in 1901. The Victorian age ended with her. But the questions surrounding her legacy never truly did. And perhaps that is why, more than a century after her death, the story of the young girl who became Queen Victoria still refuses to disappear. Queen Victoria's story ended in 1901, but the questions surrounding her life continue to this day. From a lonely child at Kensington Palace to one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history, her life was shaped by power, loss, love, and an empire that changed the world. And perhaps that is why, more than a century after her death, the story of Queen Victoria still fascinates us. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more extraordinary stories from history, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary. Thanks for watching.